Welcome to Prism Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 51 of ASP.NET Grid tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss about implementing default paging in a grid view control that uses object data source control. We'll be using table TBL employee for this demo. Obviously, to retrieve data from this table, we need to implement employee data access layer. So let's flip to Visual Studio. Let's add a class file to this project, and let's call it employee data access layer.cs. And to encapsulate employee information that's present in this table, we need to implement employee class. And just to speed things up, I have this class already implemented, so let me copy and paste that within our employee data access layer. And this is a straightforward class with 4 auto implemented properties. Now within employee data access layer class itself, we need a method to retrieve data from this table TBL employee, and to do that we need to write ADO.NET code. So let's go ahead and import the required ADO.NET namespaces: system.data, system.data.sql client, and system.configuration. Now let's copy and paste the method itself to retrieve the data. And this is straightforward ADO.NET code. So if you look at this code, all we are doing here is look at the return type of the method, list employee. It's going to return list of employees. And then the first thing that we are doing here is creating a variable of type list employee, and then using the configuration manager class, we are reading the connection string from web.config file. Using the connection string, we are then creating SQL connection object, and notice the command select star from TBL employee. So we're going to retrieve all the rows from table TBL employee, and then executing the command, loop through each row and then convert each row into an employee object. This employee object is then added to the list, and the list is finally returned. Okay, so now let's flip to webform1.aspx. Let's drag and drop a grid view control. Let's auto format this. Let's choose brown sugar scheme. Now let's drag and drop a label control. We need the label control to display this message at the bottom of the grid view control, displaying page 1 of 2. So let's drag and drop the label control, and we need to drag and drop the object data source control as well. So let's do that. Now before we configure the object data source control, we need to build our solution once, because we have just added employee data access layer, and that needs to be compiled before we can configure object data source control. So choose your business object, which is going to be demo.employee data access layer. Demo is the namespace. So click next. Let's select our method get all employees, which is going to return list of employees. Click finish. Now let's associate the grid view control with the object data source control, and look at this. The moment I do that, I get this option, enable paging. And obviously after I enable paging, look at the page numbers and the rows. By default the page size is 10, and to change that, in my table I only have 6 rows. So let's say I want to change the page size to 3. I get to the properties of the grid view control, and then we have a property page size, which is 10 by default. Let's set that to 3. And then the last thing that we want to do is to basically display the message within the label control. And in the previous session we discussed that the right event handler method in which we want to do that is the pre-render event of the grid view control. Okay, so get to the properties of the grid view control, click on the events icon, double click on pre-render event, which should generate the event handler, and let me copy and paste this code right here. And if you look at this, within label 1, we are setting the text property of the label control to the string, displaying page. And how am I getting the page that the user is currently looking at? I'm using the page index. Since that is 0 index based, I'm adding 1 to it and then converting that to string, and then we are appending this hard-coded word of, and then the total pages. How am I getting the total pages? Using the page count property, and that's a string, integer, so we are converting that to string. Alright, so with that, if I go ahead and run, we should have paging enabled with object data source control. But remember, here again we are using default paging. Okay, so I click on page 2, displaying page 2 of 2. Now every time I page through, I retrieve all the rows from TBL employee table, because at the moment we are using default paging. And default paging is bad for performance, because if there are 20,000 rows in your table, and if you're just displaying 10 to the user, you are unnecessarily retrieving all 20,000 from the database server to your web server. So there is unnecessary traffic between web server and database server. In fact, if you fire up SQL Profiler, so from SQL Server Management Studio, click on SQL Profiler, that should bring up this window. Connect by giving you a server name. So you should be able to connect to the SQL Server, and then in the event selection, clear all the events. I just want SQL batch completed event there, and then click run. Now look at this. When I click on page 1, for example page 2 now, look at the query that is sent to the database. In the SQL Profiler, we can see that select star from TBL employee. So that query is actually going to return all the rows back. And then similarly, if I change it back to page 1, the same query will be sent. Select star from TBL employee. Okay, so obviously default paging is bad for performance. In our next video, we'll actually see how to implement custom paging using object data source control. Alright, keep in mind object data source control supports both default paging and custom paging. In this video we discussed about default paging. In our next video we'll discuss about custom paging. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.